So new camera, who's this? Actually, it's new phone, but for me, new phone, new camera, but got a new phone, so we're gonna see if we can do some better videos. Hi, I'm Matt, and once a week I break down world building tricks, tips, and techniques, usually by building a world on the fly, though it has been a while since I've actually done that. In fact, today, with the theme of new beginnings, I am going, with the new phone and all that, I am going to actually redo my very first video, which was on the 4 C's of world building, which is creative, complete, consistent, and compelling. So with that in mind, let's see how these 4 C's can actually be used to help build some better worlds and maintain audience immersion. Okay, before we get started, just a little 3 things of housekeeping. First, both of these are out in hardback now, and this one hadn't been even in paperback, but yeah, these are great. Great quality. You can knock someone out with them. So if you ever feel the need to increase your libraries by 2 books, this is a great thing for world building, by the way. Second, I've been on hiatus for a couple of weeks for all 3 of you that watched this. This is partially because I was sick. We counted, and it's either the 6th or 7th time my son has gotten sick before June. And as I've read, of course that, then passes it to the adults. And I've read that in the first couple of years, you actually spend about 50% of your time with someone in the family sick, which is what it's been. I actually tried to make this video a few weeks back and coughed some stuff up in the middle of it. So this is the first time that I actually feel well enough to be making a video in quite a while. Thirdly, we've started fostering. I'm trying not to talk too much about personal stuff, but we started fostering. We've had our first kid, and we are preparing for another child, and it has kind of thrown us out of whack, and so a little flexibility from everyone, please. And if you have ever considered fostering, it is an amazing thing, and there's a lot of kids in need, so give it a thought if you ever have a chance. So enough personal stuff. I promise never to talk about that again. As I said, my first video was on the 4 C's of world building. It was terrible. I didn't have a good phone. I didn't have a mic, and I want to redo that. But since it is my first video, I should probably start with my world building kind of history. Oh, I said I wasn't going to be personal, didn't I? Anyways, actually, as I point out in this book in the intro, after I put out my first fantasy book, I got a lot of compliments on the world building. I thought, hey, I'm going to learn a lot more about world building. And I couldn't find out what was good world building. So I found the wonderful subreddit, world building. And I went there and said, hey, what are the theoretical aspects of it? Because everything I found in world building was like, this is how you do world building. And God bless them, some guy answered and had the answer that basically set me down this journey. And in it, he referenced Mark J.P. Wolf's book, Building Imaginary Worlds. It's the textbook. If you need a theoretical basis for your world building, this is the one to start with. I've probably mentioned before. It's a little dry, it's academic, because he cites everything and traces the history of fantasy world building and science fiction world building back to the 1600s. Absolutely fascinating if this is what you're looking for. But on the same time, this is where my philosophy of it came from. I didn't want the one side where you have authors who are like, this is the one way to do it. Like, King's book on writing, Stephen King's book on writing, like, this is how you do it. Orson Scott Card, same thing, like, this is how you do it. And like, well, I don't know if that's what worked for you. And on the other side, you had the academic ones of like, well, this is the theory behind it. You're like, well, not incredibly practical. So hence I tried to meld the 2. Anyways, Mark J.P. Wolf in his book mentioned 3 things for assessing or judging the world building. These are the 3 kind of table legs for it, and they were complete, consistent, and imaginative. I used that as a springboard and have added a 4th C, and well, actually I renamed imaginative to creative and then added the 4th C, which is compelling, because 4 C's sounds a lot better than 3 C's and an I, which I don't know what that would be, like a punk album maybe? No. Anyways, so 4 C's, this is really for maintaining immersion, and immersion is basically kind of the unconscious state you go into when you're reading or consuming material. You're not thinking about yourself, you are just absorbing the material, e.g. the plot, the characters, and the world building. And when something happens that breaks that immersion, you're usually unhappy. Like if it comes from the outside, where like someone's like, "Hey, go clean your room," when you're trying to read a book, you're like, "Ah, that angers me because it broke my immersion. Same thing can happen from internally within the book or story or whatever it is, when you're like, that doesn't make sense, that's bad world building, the character doesn't do that, you're just serving the plot, you're not serving the character. So there's a lot of things that can happen outside or within to break the immersive experience. Our goal as a storyteller is to keep it as seamless as possible, and that's where these 4 C's come in: creative, complete, consistent, and compelling. Let's break them down real quick. Creative is how and what degree to the world deviates from the real world. These are fantasy conceits, which maybe I have a note up about, which is part of my method, not the one and only method, but the idea of building things. This is a fantasy conceit. This is where you break the laws of nature. And that is what fantasy is at its core. Fantasy and science fiction are based upon an impossibility, something that doesn't exist quite yet in science fiction, and in fantasy that just breaks the laws of nature. We've got elves, we've got dragons, we have magic. Like, those don't exist in the real world. That's the selling point of fantasy itself. So these deviations from reality, these creative components, that's what makes it fantasy. That's what people are here in the genre for. You can measure this kind of in how big of a creative swing you take, where the genders are reversed, dimorphism. That's not actually that huge, but it can work. That kind of thing, or how many of them there are. I've pointed out that Harry Potter only has 4, Airbender only has 3 conceits, and while Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has whole bunches of them. So you need to kind of measure of how large of a change you've made to the reality and the number of them. Too many of them you can kind of get alienating, but we'll get to that in just a second. The second C is complete, and that is the sense that the world exists before the story started. There are unexplored regions in this world itself, and the world exists after the story. Unless, of course, the world is ended in the story, but which is, always what the heroes are trying to stop. And it's a sense of history and depth to the world itself. I did a survey of what people wanted, what audiences wanted in it, and history and depth and myths, the sense of depth and breadth to the world itself. Now, this can be kind of dangerous because the author has the desire to include everything. Wolf, in his textbook, calls it the encyclopedic impulse, which I think he borrowed from someone else. And that's the idea of like, well, here's all the details. Here's everything you need to know about everything. Tolkien starting with 2 chapters about the history of hobbits and where they came from, ethnographies, that kind of thing. I call it world-building kudzu, but it's kind of because, you bring it in and you just bring a little of it, but then it starts spiraling out of hand. You're like, well, this is the magic system, but we need to know a little history about that. When the gods, that's what this created the world, and then suddenly you're explaining the origin of the world itself. Like, you brought in just a little bit, and now it's exploded and grown over everything that's choking out the story itself. That's why Jemison and a few others always talk about the iceberg principle, which is actually from Hemingway, which is kind of a deviation of Chekhov's gun. Anyways, of like, you only need to include the things that are pertinent to the story. This dovetails back to inside-out world building, with the idea that people in gamings and RPGs only want world building details that pertain to this story, and the longer they spend time in it, the more they want to know about the history and the world itself. So how do you actually make that sense of depth without, going down the world-building kudzu path and choking out with all the details? This is, again, where we're indebted to Wolf with his idea of the illusion of completeness, i.e. this sense that there is, areas unexplored, there is a history, there is things that are going to happen outside of the story personally. And one of the best examples, especially growing up, and I've heard other authors talk about this, is from the very first Star Wars movie. Obi-Wan is like, oh, your father was a great pilot in the Clone Wars. That's all he said. Moving on. And I remember turning to my parents like, what were the Clone Wars? What was this? Like, oh my God, it was just a hint of a sense of history to it, of a thing that happened, just a throwaway line that eventually spawned like 2 TV series and 3 movies, but just kind of cool. It was just a sense of history, and that's the illusion of completeness. The fact that the author knows that there's more stuff, and the sense that if the audience sticks around, those things are going to be explored more. Consistent is the third C, and it is kind of interesting because it's the idea that the world adheres to an internal logic as well as the real world. Basically anything that's not covered by a fantasy conceit, i.e. whatever's not creative, where you're not changing the world, it has to adhere to the laws of the real world. Both Tolkien and Jemison mentioned that, so two ends of the spectrum of the beginning of fantasy genre, like the number one writer right now, and has a masterclass on world building, both of them recognize that the audiences use their knowledge of the real world to measure and assess the validity and consistency of the created world. They use a lot of times expert knowledge. So like if I am writing a story about horses, like we're a nomadic culture, we ride horses. I'm going to have to know my horses. I'm going to have to know my details. Now, if horses are just kind of, hairy cars in it, which is how we oftentimes use them, we just have to have like the basic, level of knowledge of that thing for it to feel consistent with the external world. So, the horse can't suddenly jump 30 feet with a rider on the back after having, ridden at a hard gallop for 8 hours. Like even, normal people, that doesn't seem right. Now, do you need to know all the tack and branding and all these, care of the horse? Not so much if it doesn't pertain to the story itself. But the more that the detail, the world building detail pertains to the story, the more important it is to the story, the more of an expert knowledge you'll need to know about it. You're also going to need to know your own internal consistencies, and this is, where I've been creative and I've broken the laws of nature. I'm going to need to keep all those details consistent. So when I say only women can use magic, and then a few minutes later a man uses magic, it either has to be a one-off where like this guy is special because of it, or like you just broke immersion for your audience because they're like, you told us that only women can use magic. And now there's this dude. Same thing if like I had dwarves are shorter than humans, and like, oh wait, this is a tall dwarf that's taller than him. Like, well, either he's something about him is special, or I just broke my own laws. So be mindful of that. Keep everything consistent within the world, within the rules that you've created, and then within the realm of the real world. Keep that all in mind, unless it is something that you're breaking the laws of nature. Finally, there's compelling, and this is the one that I added to it, so it has to be extra special, at least to me, and this is the sense of wonder. This is the dopamine pop you get when you're reading fantasy. As I said, in creative, that's why you're coming to it. This is the things that, these are the things that you're changing the world. Compelling is the sense of wonder that the audience experiences, and it really needs to be kept in mind for world building for stories. I mean, if you're just building your own world, compelling doesn't really matter. Talk about me some more, even though I said no more. And I talk about this in the book. When I was a kid, I walked dogs, and so like I came up with stories all the time, and I had this whole story about this guy named Wasp, and he had powers. He could sting people, he could climb walls because of his little hooks in his hands, and basically it turned into kind of this X-Men-esque story of these kids that are recruited into this school full of kids with power, and they within the secret school learn to save the world using these powers that people don't know about and don't like them. And then years later I read X-Men and like, oh, I kind of made this, and like, oh, and I read Harry Potter, like, oh, like I did this too. Not saying that this Harry Potter isn't its own unique thing. Even people have pointed out the similarities between it and Gaiman's books of magic, and even Gaiman's like, no, it's just cursory. Anyways, the idea is that Harry Potter isn't great at being creative. Like, no, it's a magic school. Like, yeah, we've seen that. No, it's there's no kind of new ground broken in it. There's nothing that's like, wow, that's totally new. Like magic school, Earthsea did that. Kids with magic, Earthsea did that. The magic itself is pretty basic. Point your wand. I always have a wand. Point your wand and say some words. Like, okay, not a terribly imaginative, doesn't really break new ground and creative. In completeness, it's really just Hogwarts and a little bit on the extra, and that's where it excelled, is Hogwarts. And when they started exploring the extra world and Fantastic Beasts, which I just watched, and it was kind of bad, and I should probably write about why it didn't work so much, but that's kind of it. Like, the world isn't complete. It is really insular, and it's best when it's insular. It's not even terribly consistent. There is a list of 200 and something inconsistencies within the world itself. So, not picking on Harry Potter because it's huge, and if I could have written Harry Potter, like, I own a wand from Harry Potter. Like, it is a really good thing, and that's because it's so compelling. that everything was weaponized, the creativeness was made and specifically gave people what they wanted. Remember that fantasy is an escapism. Tolkien talks about it being escapism, and he talks about it like it's great to be escapism. Like you're like a prisoner leaving, like imagining all these other things. It's awesome. And fantasy is also a lot about wish fulfillment. Again, literally, we want to travel to a new world, see new things that don't exist in the real world. Boredom just is the boredom is the mind killer? No, boredom is just the anathema to fantasy itself. It's just what knocks you out of it. It's what makes the slog, which we talk about a lot. And it was a lot of why I don't think the latest Fantastic Beasts movies worked, because it was just boring. Some of the Star Wars is like, this is just tedious now. And that just can't work for it. You got to remember to keep it compelling at all times. And then one of the reasons, and this need to remain compelling is the reason we adhere to tropes as much. The classic farm boy orphan with a sword is destined to save the world from a dark lord because of a prophecy. Is this Star Wars or Harry Potter that I'm talking about? I mean, is it a wand? The wand's pretty much the sword. It's the same thing in both of them. They work. They are so compelling because those are great stories and people want them. And, you'd be a fool not to give the audiences what they want. Also, a side note, the farm boy with the sword is a great outsider, which allows the mentor to spoon feed the audience information. This is imparted. This is a soft impart, and I think there's another video about it, so check it out if you feel so inclined. Okay, so with the 4 C's in mind, one thing to also keep in mind is that they can work against each other. For instance, the more complete you make your world, the more time you spent in it, the more time the audience has spent in it, the more details you've added to it, are the more details that you need to keep up with or your audience keeps up with, which makes it so much harder to be consistent. George R. R. Martin talked about I had trouble keeping these things consistent. He had to actually turn to people who had written about his own stuff to keep his facts straight, and they ended up writing a book on the world building of it with him. Hopefully it's up, because I don't remember the name of it offhand. There's a story that Tolkien's son talked about with writing. The reason that his father wrote down The Hobbit was because it was an oral story that he told him every night, and the son said something about well, you said that the door was blue last time and now it's red. And his father walks off and goes, that damn kid, and started writing The Hobbit because of it. So again, the more complete the world is, the more difficult it is to keep the world consistent. You got to keep details like the colors of doors in hand, and what the chainmail that they're wearing and what kind of other eye collars. That's why I strongly suggest keeping a Bible and writing that stuff down. All my characters, the first line in it is what they look like, any details that I've given about them. One of the more interesting, at least to me, places where they interfere with each other is creative versus compelling. And this is kind of where you want to push yourself. I want to add more and more things. I want to have, explore this more of these changes to the world, it's going to mean this, and it's going to mean this, it's going to mean this. And then also, on the other hand, compelling is your pop sensibilities. I listen to music a lot, and I got to talk to I got to talk to an artist one time who's kind of big in the Dallas music scene many years ago. And anyways, and it was why do you keep pushing yourself to this? Why is this new song that you put out have 3 key signature changes and time signatures or whatever they are? Everything keeps changing. He's you got to push yourself. You got to make new, and you can't get stale. But at the same time, the audience is there for the hits. They want the big, simple song that you can hum, and it's got a great beat. And I don't care if it doesn't make sense. Give me the same hits that everyone else is doing. So you have that internal push to do more versus the audience wanting the greatest hits. Radiohead is, to me, the perfect example, and I love this band. I remember where I was when I heard Creep the first time. I remember where I was when I heard The Bends, the single that they released from it, Fake Plastic Trees was the single. I remember where I was driving, I was on a date, I don't remember the girl's name, but I remember that, where that song was. And, I haven't enjoyed a Radiohead album since 2005. They seem to have forgotten of we have the capacity to do all these things, but does the audience want them? They've stop making songs to me that are enjoyable, despite like going and breaking new ground and being like jazz, basically, that, you know, the musician's musician, where like, oh wow, look at what all they're doing, it's so technical, like, but does the audience want that? For Radiohead, yes, the audience seems to keep wanting it, and they are, you know, Radiohead. So anyway, but that's just the idea of things to keep in mind. Like, you want to be creative, you want to break new ground, you want to do all sorts of weird stuff that no one's seen before, and the audience does want weird, but they don't want to be alienated by it. So keep the audience in mind when you're telling stories with your world building. So keep the balance of the 4 C's in mind: creative, complete, consistent, compelling. They can, contradict each other, they can work against each other, but when you have them all in mind when you're working, they help keep the audience's experience immersive, and that can help you build some better worlds.